BAM is a communications agency that believes stories move the world. We move stories forward for technology-driven brands that challenge, change, and create entire industries. Today on the show, we have Brian Dema, Silicon Valley Bank's Director of Marketing Strategy. Brian knows startups, B2B, data-driven marketing, channels, and the intersection of marketing and sales. He is an avid sailor and a novice kiteboarder, and he plays the saxophone in a blues band. Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, welcome to Dear BAMF, the podcast for PR and marketing pros. We have two excellent pros on today. Neha Singh, who's from our BAM Communications team, Head of Marketing and Innovation, and then Brian Dema over at Silicon Valley Bank, Head of Marketing, Head Honcho Extraordinaire. Thank you guys for being on.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Beck.
Yeah. We have some good questions for today for some hairy marketing situations, so we're going to dive in. The first one I'll read off right now. Dear BAMF, I want to be a data-driven marketer, but I feel like there is so much data to digest. How do you parse through the, quote, data noise and figure out what is a priority? More importantly, how do you explain to your executives what is a priority and what is not? Brian, you want to kick this one off?
Sure, I'll jump in. Well, for data projects, I try to start with the story. What story do I hope to tell from that information? And when you start, that story is just a guess or a hypothesis, but then it gets written as you dig into the data and draw connections between things. Keeping that story in mind as you do your analysis will help keep you on track, keep the big picture in mind, keep you from going down any rabbit holes, and really ensure that anything you produce is actually meaningful and useful.
Mm-hmm. Just before, Neha, you jump in, what are you using, Brian, if you would tell everybody, like, what are the typical data tools you're using to look in how you analyze, let's say, a story or a big pitch you guys are going out with?
Sure. I mean, obviously, Excel, I think it just ends up being the easiest. We do some regression analysis, probably could be doing more. There's so many tools when you get into the black box mathematical tools, but I feel like it always has to come back to these kind of analyst-driven models where you can actually say this produced that. This had a reaction. You need to be able to tell kind of, again, the connections between things. So we try and keep it pretty simple. Obviously, we use things like Google Analytics, other analytics tools. I think Neha is more the expert on this side.
Go ahead, Neha.
Yeah, for sure. I'd agree with Brian. I think it's really important to stick with a storyline first, but to be even more tactical about it in terms of the day-to-day application. And we do this here at BAM too, right? You have to start with your objectives and your key results. And I think a lot of times old school marketers would say, oh no, marketing just works and it's, going to bring you brand awareness, but there is a science to it. And if you're focusing in your marketing goals around say an OKR structure where you have objectives and key results and those bubble up to the objectives and key results of your company, it'll make it really easy for you to draw a line between where your marketing initiatives are bringing in impact, how they're measuring against business objectives, and figuring out exactly where you need to focus your time so that when you talk to your executives, you have a clear picture to point at to say, hey, we're working on this, we're not working on that. And here are the metrics that we actually are assessing. We hear the key results that we're assessing here. And there are a variety of ways, just like Brian said, to do that. There is the simple way of an Excel sheet, which is actually very powerful. But if you have an opportunity to grab onto some tools, you can take a look at Google Analytics, your social media analytics. If you have a CRM that is bringing in leads, you can take a look at your lead flow counts through your website, through other avenues as well. And if you want somewhere where you can aggregate all of these things, I've built dashboards in the past, for instance, for my executives through tools like Tableau or SciSense or Mode or Segment or DataBox, whatever it may be, so that I also have a place to point them to and say, hey, this is all the information you need right in one dashboard. So lots of different approaches, but I think, overall, it's just about giving them a story and a focus.
One thing I'd add to that is what drives me crazy, and I've seen this a couple times before, is like, oh, look at this post got this many shares or this just many engagements and the unique visitors is like 41 million to this thing. I'm like, who cares? Like, did they get anything to the bottom line? So you could dazzle with those metrics all the time that are purely vanity, in my opinion, for a lot of these, unless you're then pulling the full through line of, and this is what it did for the bottom line or top of the funnel leads or activations with sales calls or something like that. A lot of times I find that's what moves and is of interest to an executive, not, oh my gosh, you're on Forbes and that has 41 million unique views a month.
Totally. Yeah, I very much agree. It's about putting that data in real context about what it means for the business, and awareness is not enough usually. One of the other keys of how I look at it is really looking at this in time and over time. So it's not just about that big report at the end of the quarter or a dashboard that you hope the execs will look at and they never do. It's what is happening each week, right? What are the 5 simple numbers they can look at and that change each week? Often, even if they're not perfect, even if the amounts, the numbers are really low, it's still very telling. So that's a lot of what I've been putting in place with our marketing. It's just, what are 3 to 5 things I can track each week and then religiously track them.
Yeah, we were talking this was actually on a webinar just last week that Mike, our CRO, and I hosted for a group of clients around SEO. And one of the things that came to light there, and I resonate so much with what Brian just said about time and overtime. If you even just take something like SEO, you need to make sure that you're monitoring keywords weekly. You need to make sure that you're adjusting your keyword strategy monthly, and you need to be assessing your impact quarterly. It is not just something that you do at the end of the year or on a quarterly basis or biannual basis. Mm-hmm. You need to be making sure that you have the infrastructure there to track on a consistent basis so you can get to what Brian is saying, which is that over time look or the comparison look, which is so integral to your results.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Brian, before we get on to this next question, just curious, what are those 4 or 5 metrics? Or could you give us if that's too inside information, could you give us a ballpark on what those are? And then also how you drilled it down to just that?
Sure. How I look at it I'm working at a bank now, obviously, but
yeah,
I look at the same kind of metrics when I'm doing work with a startup. And basically I try and look at 1 or 2 key metrics from each part of the funnel. So starting at the top, with awareness, into engagement, and then really focusing on your conversion metrics, wherever they are. Typically, that's how many leads did we get and where did they come from? Mm-hmm. Ideally, it's then connecting that back to the actual business results of how many new clients did we get, or what did we sell? What was our cross-sell? What was our retention? And things like that. So I often just kind of start with 1 or 2. At the top, it might be something like web sessions or unique visitors. It might be some of your paid media metrics around impressions and things like that. But then getting into, hey, what are we seeing digitally in terms of form fills or different types of leads? And then are they converting on the back end?
Pretty straightforward. I like it. Let's go to our next question. Oh, and it's COVID related, of course. Dear BAMF, with COVID-19, the face of marketing is changing. Would you recommend marketers approach their strategic plans any differently than before? What could I alter during this time that could have impact? That's a very broad question, but what would you say? Neha, do you want to start off with this one?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot that needs to change. And the reason why is because 2 things are happening right now that I think people may think are just COVID related, but they're actually changing the entire face of how we do marketing and, quite frankly, PR. And that number 1 is everything is going to be digital. If it wasn't already, it's going to be more so than before. And a lot of companies that were able to get away with not being digital, not being mobile optimized, they're being forced to. And that's really the second piece, which is being mobile optimized. It's not an option anymore to not have a mobile friendly site. Before, we used to always tell people for SEO purposes or just to be cross device, but now people are on their devices more than ever. Just the other day, I was reading that internet usage itself is up 50 to 70%.
Wow.
Consumption behaviors are changing too because of that. If you're going to have people online so much more than ever before, that habit is going to continue to a certain degree post-COVID as well. So brands that are focusing in on amazing experiences, whether that they be online through an Instagram live series or through guides and webinars, that is all going to hold true post-COVID as well. So I think people need to take a look at their strategic plans, figure out what are the things that will work in this environment, which things won't work. And instead of just thinking about short-term possibilities, think about long-term gains. So if you're doing something today because you're in COVID, and this not because you're in COVID, but you're dealing with the COVID situation and your business is impacted by it, take a look at the long-term game. One of the things that I'd recommend, and I'll pass it over to Brian, is SEO and paid media is a big opportunity right now. There are a lot of companies that actually are slashing their budgets because they cannot pay for paid search ads anymore. That's an opportunity for companies that do have a little bit of residual cash to now just take over those search terms, and boom, post-COVID, they're going to be at the forefront again. So it's about taking a look at your strategic plan, figuring out what makes sense, and then also identifying key opportunities that will give you those long-term gains after the pandemic is over.
Mm-hmm. Brian?
Yeah, I definitely second some of your thoughts about what's changing in the world post-COVID. And I'm pretty optimistic about new channels and types of marketing that will be more important. So we all know that virtualizing once in-person events is key. We've been on a million Zooms lately, but I too think this will continue. And I think we're going to need more ways to connect people and build real relationships online. My personal guess is that we'll increasingly see the merging of online and offline events with a greater focus on the long tail after events. That's something SVB really is concerned with. So, how do we nurture those people and follow up and really track it? And I think we're only going to see more of that because people are getting more used to this way of working. Mm-hmm. I think there's a few other principles to keep in mind in terms of just dealing with this change. And I'm working at a bank, so we're really at the forefront of some of what's going on. A few things we keep in mind are really focusing on your clients, and for VCs, focusing on your portfolio startups, right? Leading with empathy for what they're going through and helping where you can. I mean, trying to be very clear, transparent, and upfront with what you can do and what you can't do. Another area would be focusing on your core. So doing what you're best at and making that the way that you help. I've seen some startups do things just for the sake of doing them, kind of let's not waste a good crisis kind of stuff. And honestly, there's just too much uncertainty going around to play that game. Maybe lastly, I'd say start with a good dose of humility as well, because nobody can predict the future, and you really need to give yourself a whole lot of breaks with this because things are going to change, and just know that you can change with them, but take a little time to breathe while you're going.
If I could add one last thing on there, I think this is really for the executives and the CEOs out there. Typically during most crisis situations or funding situations, marketing teams are typically the first to go. That's usually where people make the most cuts because typically we have the largest budgets. But right now, it's a very different scenario. Right now, you do need your positioning and your messaging to be 100% spot on. You need to show empathy to your audience. You need to focus on your core audience, like Brian said, and you need to be centering your marketing strategies on using your content or your other channels to create powerful online connections. So I think right now, CEOs and other executives can really look to their marketers to figure out who can stretch that dollar right now during a time of pandemic, and also who are the marketers who just aren't going to be afraid to experiment and push through.
Brian, curious on, this is a follow-up question for you, just coming from a bank that banks we traditionally think of as like, oh, so relationship driven and you were mentioning just the relationships and like how you build them in person, but also offline. Is there been anything that you've been pursuing right now during this time to bolster those relationships while you can't be in person?
Yeah, so SVB does something like 1,000 events a year, and we're really known for event marketing. That's kind of our secret sauce of connecting the right founders and the right investors and getting them in a room so magic can happen, right? That's changing now. So our events team, I would give them a huge shout out. They have rapidly transitioned to this kind of virtual environment, and we're holding, I don't know what the numbers are, but many webinars each week, particularly around how to deal with COVID and the recent stimulus package for all different areas of our clients. And I think we're only going to see more of that. In fact, that was something we were trying to do in previous years, and we had set up some of the building blocks, and kind of thank goodness we did, because we were able to transition really quickly. So that has been helping, but generally, it's hard out there, and it's a lot about talking with your clients. I personally have been taking a lot of client service, calls and emails as I know everyone is, even our executive team. And it's just listening and doing what we can.
Mm-hmm. Well, there goes that empathy piece back to tie into that. Let's go to our next question here. It ties to kind of COVID, but let's see how we would approach this on the executive front. So, dear Bamp, how do you approach, quote, recalibration, unquote, with the executive when it comes to goals and priorities? Obviously, a relevant question right now. And Neha, to your point, when you brought up, to the executives and CEOs on things. So yeah, how would you guys handle this in, let's say, regular time, but also in COVID environment time, on coming to your executive team and saying like, okay, all those grand plans we had and all those numbers we were going to hit, not going to happen. So this is now what's going to happen.
Yeah, this could be really hard and harder than changing your own mind, right? Because execs can have a lot riding on these plans that were made in different times, and opening their minds can be a challenge. So couple of things. One, if you have it, start with data and research, show what's really happening and why a change of direction is needed. Hopefully that data will get others to listen. I think maybe one of the biggest things I've seen recently helpful for a number of startups is presenting a timeline and a phased approach for this. So the idea is we might not know everything right now, and that's okay. So just take one step at a time, but schedule a point in the future to make bigger changes as things become more clear. So I'm seeing companies approach changes to, say, their advertising and messaging in this fashion, laying out different messages and stories to tell over time as the market transitions from the phases of anxiety around reacting to the crisis to beginning to adjust to it, to transitioning to a new normal as we get beyond it and start to see the full impact. This kind of phased approach, I think, is a bit easier to digest for everybody, including executives, rather than wholesale change all at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I feel like the phased approach is 100% correct. And the reason why is because this is a moment in time that you do have to change everything, but we also don't know how long that change will persist. So you do need to give a phased approach, and you need to give different scenarios to be able to say, if in 6 months this doesn't get better, this is what we're doing. In 3 months, this is what we're going to do. And being okay with changing the plan, saying, hey, like, we're going to have to take this on a week-by-week basis or a month-by-month basis or even quarterly basis, right? And making sure that you're educating them, just like Brian said, with research and data, being reasonable about your goals. Don't set yourself up for failure. If you are really unsure about how you're going to reach those revenue goals or those targets for leads, make sure that you scale them down and give a reasonable picture about what is achievable. I also think that with some executives right now, they're really frenzied. Right now, they don't know what to do. They don't know where to put their eggs right now. We're dealing with a lot of clients like this too, who are coming to us and they're saying, hey, do I need more PR? Do I need a website refresh? What should I do for SEO? Should I just pay a lot of money for paid media? Mm-hmm. Just because it's a crisis doesn't mean that you need to lose focus. And I think this goes back to Brian's earlier point of like, maintaining your story. Your story does develop and change over time, and you need to figure out what that story is right now and how it phases out and how is it changing throughout your phased out approach to ensure that you have some focus. And also making sure that you as a marketer are highlighting your value as much as possible right now to an executive. And what I mean by that is when you're under a normal circumstance where business is running as usual, one thing I hear from some of our CEOs is, well, I'm just going to put like $10,000 or $20,000 towards some paid media campaigns. It'll be great. I'll get leads in. It's going to be awesome. Good to go. And those types of CEOs are panicking right now because they don't have the money to spend. So your value as a marketer right now will shine through if you can also point out the organic opportunities and the creative opportunities to sit there and reposition the business and give new ideas. So I feel like recalibration really comes with, number one, research and data, like Brian said. Number two, understanding of where you're at and where you can actually go. And number three, just staying calm and showing your value.
Staying calm, people. There's a lot of spaghetti on the wall going around. And I'm particularly doing an article for Fast Company about how to not lose your brand amid this whole time, how to prevent continental drift of it, which is in this vein. Okay. Last question here that we're going to cover today, guys. What are the top data mistakes you see PR and marketing folks make today? Is there a way you've avoided the quote unquote data traps that you can share?
All over the board, really. At a high level, the data mistakes that I see are typically around misunderstanding or misrepresenting data, right? Sometimes that's about correlation versus causation, or assuming that the future will be like the past. But mostly it's about not explaining the true confidence that you have in the data. Like, how accurate is it really? There's been a big movement in the sciences recently to weed out unsound research, things like that. And that's not to say studies done for marketing or PR purposes need to have huge sample sizes or involve complicated statistical analysis. They don't always. But it's important to understand the basics of sampling and error, right? And doing so will make you powerful, will give you armor when you talk with execs, as we were talking about earlier, and it'll keep anyone from really pulling the wool over your eyes. I would say one of the big caveats I would give to even the advice I gave earlier around telling stories with data is you need to be careful that you don't stick to the wrong story when the data tells you otherwise and when it changes. In other words, let yourself be surprised. Give yourself the space to learn and to adjust as new information presents itself. I think that's one of the truly great and interesting things about being a marketer is constantly getting market information and information from outside of the company, but you got to listen to it. I would say in my own past and when I've done consulting, these are a lot of the issues that I see is like, hey, you've got information, maybe you make too much of it, or you don't quite understand how good, bad, or ugly it is. And even when new information comes, are you kind of updating that story and keeping a beginner's mind?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I feel like Brian and I bonded about when we met in San Diego was this exact notion that people are so caught up in matching data to the story instead of finding the story in the data. People are constantly looking at research studies. They're looking at Google Analytics. They're looking at lead data, whatever it may have you in front of you. And you're sitting there and you're trying to match all of those data points to a story or a hypothesis or a narrative that you've already created or your executives have already created. And instead, what you need to be doing is finding the story in the data. And that's something that people aren't doing. And right now, that's actually the most important. You might be surprised with, hey, we're getting uptick in traffic from Mexico. Okay, why? Figure that out, because that's actually going to be the most important. So I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make. But also going into this, we were just having this conversation with a client today, and they've been struggling to figure out what bucket they fit in terms of analytics, insights, or intelligence. And it was a really interesting discussion because I think this goes into the data traps that people need to avoid and the earlier point that Brian brought up too around where you're fitting in the data. And it was this discussion around analytics versus insights versus intelligence. And the fact that analytics is what a lot of marketers fall into the trap of, where there's so much information, there's so much data, they're all the data points that they're throwing at you, and they're getting caught up in that. And then you have the layer of marketers who take it a step further with insights. Now they're taking a look at that data that's in front of them and those analytics, and they're trying to tell a story of the data. But again, it's like, I have this data set, I need to just figure out a story that matches against this. So great. It needs to justify what I want.
Yeah.
But then the third layer of intelligence, which is where you're actually layering different data sets together. You're trying to figure out what these data sets are telling you and move forward. I mean, I think a lot of the companies right now with COVID data, for instance, like, anything related to security, for instance, or internet usage or mobile app usage, and they're layering it with information about COVID-19 cases and places where they're reopening and we're seeing more of this, et cetera. Like, that's interesting. That is where you are going to find those moments where, the data is actually telling you something as opposed to you thinking that you're narrating it. So that's a long-winded way to say that, like, I think that's the biggest mistake, is that people just get caught up in showing their CEOs like a big spreadsheet of numbers. What the hell does this even say? Like, what does this even mean? And is this even helpful? And I think that's the biggest thing, is like, if you're showing all this data, but it actually doesn't roll up to the objectives, like, why did you show it in the first place?
Yeah.
Totally. And keep it simple. Right. It's just like in PR, right? It's distilling things down to just a couple of solid stats that's going to knock somebody's socks off. That's all you need. Then get on with it, and that's often the best way to tell the story, particularly to an executive is, tell them what you're going to tell them up front, and make sure it's what they need to hear. and tell it in a way that they can understand.
4 to 5 bullet points. That's Brian's march. I think that's the catch-all that I'm getting from this. This is good. Yes, go ahead, Neha.
I actually don't even ask. I would say it's a question and a comment back to your earlier point. Like one of the things that you said was, I just want to know what it does for my bottom line. And then you went into like, what about my top funnel? What about this portion? What about that portion? But I think that's exactly the data trap that people fall into as marketers, is that they're so focused on trying to explain how something affected the bottom line that they don't explain the different core metrics that actually are related to each aspect of the funnel, like Brian was talking about. I think that's actually a big data trap, because you're equating all of the amazing data you have available to you in context of the bottom line. But actually what you should be doing is breaking it up and saying, this is what relates at this point of the funnel. These are the 5 metrics for top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel. And this is what we're focused on here. Bottom line, what you're actually going to get is that all of these aspects will help your bottom line. They will help them in different ways, but it's not just going to be one catch-all thing. Like a webinar is not going to necessarily help my bottom line immediately. It might have a slow burn, but an in-person event will. So just being honest about that as to like what data actually matches up with your channels, and how that overall impact is for your bottom line. So curious, Brian, if you had any thoughts on that, because you just mentioned something similar, but curious what your thoughts are.
It's a super tough balance. And I think I've screwed it up more than I've got it right of, how many metrics, what's actually important, what can people digest, and how do I present it to them? So I'm making a report right now, just internal for one of our business units. And my goal was to have 5 metrics total, to kind of keep it simple, stupid principle. I think I came out with something like 25, something ridiculous like that. And it's currently involving a 1.5 pages of commentary on what that all means, every week. And I would give myself maybe a C+ on that one. At least I got the data, right? And I'm starting to make, meaningful findings from it. But I think it needs to be simpler, right? And you have to think through the relative priority of these things. On my end, in previous roles I've had in other companies, paid media metrics are notorious for this. You show people clicks and impressions and click-through rate, and that's really not meaningful to an executive at a high level. It might be meaningful when I'm optimizing different channels and things like that. And so there's really this judgment call of, do I show it on the report, or is it just something that I kind of keep in my own back pocket? And I don't know. I'm learning. I'd say I'm halfway there, but hopefully we'll get a better grade next time.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for listening to Dear Banff, the advice podcast for PR and marketing pros like you. Our show is created by BAM, a PR and marketing agency headquartered in San Diego and New York City. The music you're enjoying today was composed by Tiffany Dizon, produced by Daniel Kessner, and played by San Diego Symphony's Art of Alon. Thank you to our podcast production team at Citizen Recording. If you have a tough PR and marketing question you'd like us to answer, please write to us at bamtheagency.com/Dear Banff. Don't forget the F. We'll be back next Monday with another episode of Dear Banff. Until then,